Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Dare to Teach series, as we are calling this series of comments on how we will think of the integral teacher. We now are in core value number 1, honesty. I'm taking these 12 core values that we'll be speaking of in groups of 4. This one, honesty, forgiveness, freedom, and love, compassion, will be our first 4. And I'm doing this with some sense of possibly a kind of prioritization or hierarchy. Now, the assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side when you're looking there at Dare to Teach, the playlist. We've already given 2 previous introductory lectures that will be as well provided or linked in the comments section for this lecture. I want to give you a challenge now right away. And that is what we will call for these conversations the teacher's learning journals. And by that I mean we're going to challenge you to flow these lectures, but more importantly to respond to them in some creative ways through some kind of journaling. Think of it this way. Those of you who have taught at least a decade in a classroom, wouldn't it be fascinating if you could go back to your first year of teaching and you had journals that would speak specifically about some of the challenges, some of the successes that you had during that time, and the way in which you were processing all of the things that were happening in your first year of teaching. Now, for some of us, we actually did that, and of course, going back and reading that information is very useful. I'm going to challenge you right here in this series of talks, as you work through them with us, to take some notes, to be reflective, and to try to see what it is that you can gain from the experience. Now, I want to pause here now that we're actually into these comments, and I just want to point out a couple of, like, it gets dark at night, obvious things, but I just want to say it nonetheless. I mean, we have a saying in Room 303, the new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W, and by that we mean, of course, to rephrase that idea from the classic writer of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Of course, there is something K-N-E-W under the sun, and I only say this to say the following. I in no way want to make the argument that in the series of talks that are about to happen, that I'm in any way coming up with new information about teaching. We're going to be talking about the oldest of the oldest. I mean, we're going to reference Socrates right away. So, I mean, we've been talking about these ideas for a very long time. However, we do have this tendency to sometimes forget, and so this will be a process of trying to maybe reclaim some information for ourselves. The way I like to quote it from Ken Wilber's integral model is, no human mind is capable of 100% error. I like that idea. In other words, we're all bringing ideas to this question of what makes great teaching. I'm calling it the integral teacher. I remember after U2 had released their Joshua Tree album that in a Rolling Stone interview, Bono was asked about writing songs, and the commentator or the interviewer said, yeah, you know, it seems pretty easy for you to write songs. And Bono said, writing songs for me is as easy as walking down the street. Writing good songs isn't. And the minute I heard that, as I was beginning my experience in the classroom, I recognized that it's so true. I mean, teaching is as easy as walking down the street. Good teaching is not. And so we want to kind of challenge ourselves. Now, let me just pause here and make a personal observation. Almost all of the stuff that I do out of 303 and to learnstrong.net is, of course, me as a teacher teaching students. And while I know that a few teachers commonly hit my stuff, it's fascinating for me to consider the fact that now I am a teacher speaking to teachers in this series of talks, and that is very humbling and, dare I say it, a little bit frightening. I think of it this way. When I teach, for example, Dante's Inferno, and we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net over that, and we come to passage 24 of Inferno, and Dante the Pilgrim has had enough. I'm so tired, and he sits down, and with good reason, I mean, given what he's just seen, experienced. He sits down, and it is the Virgil character who has to say to him in lines that are memorized by my students in 303, because they're going to need these lines sooner or later in their life. Up on your feet. This is no time to tire. The man who lies asleep will never wake in fame, and his desire drift past him like a dream in a stream, and on it goes. It's fascinating for me to consider the fact that I've always taught those sets of lines to my students. That is to say, I've always challenged them to up on your feet. Now I am speaking these lines. Allow me to at times be your Virgil to your Dante the Pilgrim, if you get my drift. In other words, I hope that in the process of my comments here, beginning with honesty, that I will be challenging myself, which is fundamentally the first reason I'm giving these talks, to remember what really matters, but I hope that I can challenge you as well. And in this regards, it is fascinating to think about the teacher as what I often have referred to as the 3 Ds. When I'm talking to young teachers, I'll often say to them, basically it's 3 Ds. We want to think about the teacher as, first of all, a distributor, no question of, we might say, a distributor of knowledge, right, information. But that's not all. I mean, some of us have, unfortunately, thought that was our job, but no. We're also, I would say, a developer of character, a developer of ways of thinking, critical thinking skills, and the like. So we're as well that, but we're also, I think, as we already heard from our Song of Myself, passage 46-47 study, we're also a destroyer. Destroyer of bad habits, destroyer of old ways of thinking. And we're going to come back to this idea as well. I think it's a crucial one. Hey, do you remember when that in Song of Myself, speaking of Song of Myself, guys? I told you I'm a humanist and a literary instructor, so I'm going to build off of stories because we're the stories that we tell and retell. Do you remember when the kid comes to Whitman, the poet, in Song of Myself, passage 6, and picks up the grass and says, "What is this?" All the biologists in the house love this question, right? What is this? And it's Whitman, the teacher, that says, "How could I answer the child? I didn't know any better than the child." And then he says, "Perhaps it is." That's that fallibilist position epistemologically. And I have that feeling as well now as I wade into this. The first of our 12 core values, as I'll talk about them. And I'll talk about them now starting with honesty. Now, note, I'm going to often define words a little bit differently than expected. So you want to hear what I have to say in regards to definitions. For example, no, I do not mean when I say teachers have to be honest that we always have to tell the truth. That to me is a silly definition. It's also wrong-headed in a number of ways. I mean, great teachers, think of this. Great teachers are often a kind of liar. I mean, we're hiders of the truth at times. We're great players. We're often actors. I mean, think about Socrates in Plato's Apology, right? When he says, I'm just not a very good speaker, so I'm not real good at this thing of arguing, and here I am in a court for the first time in my life in my 70s. And of course, readers of this, as I've taught my students, and we give them full lectures on all of Apology and Republic on learnstrong.net, for those of you who want to run that to ground, it's always fun when Socrates starts saying, I'm not really good at something, that you might want to just back up because the bad is coming. So I'm going to point out, we often will tell kids that we believe they can do things as students that we know they can't do, and here comes the key word, yet, right? That is to say, I can have a student that I know is probably not going to be able to accomplish one of the tasks I'm about to give to her, but I'm not going to tell her, look, I know you're going to completely fail at this task, but I want you to try anyway. No, I'm going to encourage her to try. To that degree, no, I do not mean, by honesty, that we're always going to simply, quote-unquote, tell the truth, right? I mean, I think of it this way. I knew a teacher who had to speak her mind to the administration. Oh, she was upset. She needed to do this. Unfortunately, she didn't have a job the next year, and she was, after the fact, she was the first one to admit, I probably should have thought a little bit better about just this idea of always needing to share my truth. I mean, we learn this in our study, for example, of the Stoics and Marcus Aurelius, that idea, okay, you may have opinions, but why do you have to always share those opinions? It's a classic question, and I think, that's one of those questions, again, I'll ask a number of them in our series together here, that you could maybe write down and join in your own teacher's learning journals. Why is it that often we have to give our opinion, even if it's unsolicited? So, for example, an administrator is going to employ a new policy, for example. Just sit back and notice the number of teachers that are going to weigh in with opinions. They're not even asked about this opinion, but they're very quickly going to have an opinion. It's not that you can't have an opinion. We all have them. The question is, why do we feel so obligated often to say what we think? That is to say, I have to share my truth. Well, if that's not what I mean by honesty, then what do I mean by honesty? Because I'm starting there, and I'm going to call it a certain kind of awareness or perception. We've used this term perspicacity before. And as well, with that, a certain kind of harmony. Now, I'll say it this way. To survive very long in a classroom, you got to accept that someday you will be replaced. This is, in my estimation, this is central, right? There's two things that you and I both know for sure. That we're here, in a classroom, or on this planet, but not for long. And it's that not for long thing, that brevity of our life's work, that gives the precious quality of our life's work, in my estimation. We live in the mountains, and the Bighorn Mountains out here. And of course, East Tennessee Lake, it's hard to get there. Just imagine yourself there, those beautiful mountain lake, right? I've got this stone in my hand, I toss it out into the middle of this still lake that looks like a mirror. And the moment that it hits, you have those concentric circles that are, of course, beautifully going to expand. There's my word picture. Let's think about the expanding circles of influence one more time. Starting with, of course, the first drop into the water will be the teacher. By extension, the teacher's students. And then finally, everyone else outside of the classroom. These are all going to be significant, and there must be a sense of a certain kind of balance or awareness of what really matters. That's how I'm defining honesty. For example, we can never, as teachers, allow the opinions of our students or administration or anyone outside of our classroom to somehow be more important than our own truth, our own self-honesty. To me, this is central. I love texts of strategy, so we'll reference, for example, Sun Tzu's Art of War at some point in our conversation. But my favorite strategy text is the great samurai warrior Musashi in his classic book of Five Rings. Now, this is a cat who is considered the greatest single fighter samurai with swordplay. And he retires and goes to a cave where he only has a single student, purportedly, who writes down his training manual. Now, this is the greatest sword player of all time, and he's going to make a list of the most important things you got to know if you're going to be a great sword fighter. And the very first one is, do not think dishonestly. Now, I find that fascinating. It's interesting. I talked to a teacher that was about to quit a number of years ago, and she just came out loud and she said, I got to be honest. I've told myself all my career that I love teaching, and I finally had to admit that I really don't. It was that moment of self-honesty that finally led me to say, I'm going to have to get out of this profession because I don't love it. I don't enjoy it. There's just too much chaos, and we'll talk about maybe some reasons why that could be the case. Now, I will define honesty as the ability to appreciate all four of Ken Wilber's four quadrants, right, as it relates to ourselves, as it relates to our students, as it relates to others. That is to say, a balance and a harmony. Yes, teachers have no question, a physical body, upper right quadrant. But we also have our mind, our spiritual development, our psyche, upper left quadrant. But we also are a product of a culture, and we live within a culture, lower left quadrant. And of course, there's systems that are a part of everything in our lives, the lower right quadrant. If we're not balancing all four of those for ourselves, there isn't any way we're going to be effective with our students, who, by the way, as well share in those four quadrants. And of course, those outside our room as well share in those four quadrants, no question. With that in mind, I can give the example of the coach, great coach, I knew him well, who was successful. Very successful, but he ended up having to leave the classroom and coaching early because he had sacrificed his own health to accomplish the goal of victory. In the end, I just simply qualified this kind of action as dishonest. Why? Well, he was successful with student athletes in the classroom, but what he wasn't successful with was taking care of himself. And because he didn't balance all these different elements, I'm going to call that an act of dishonesty. Do you understand? Do you understand how I'm now using this? So, what is the teacher's goal? Well, I will argue that our goal is to leave the world we live in a little more awakened than we found it, a little more mindful than we found it. However, that has to start with me as the instructor. I can't affect my students in any way to become more awakened if I myself have not worked to be awakened. Now, of course, there is the challenge of power within the classroom, right? Think of it this way. Kids are very sophisticated today. In fact, I'm going to make an argument later in these talks that I think kids today are more sophisticated than they were 30 years ago and more when I started working in 303. Now, some of you are going to roll your eyes and say, oh, that's absurd. There is absolutely no way you can make that argument. I think I can. But here's one of the ways I know that to be true. Kids today, our students today, are far more astute observers. I'll give you an example. Very first day, class 303, number of years ago. Young lady walks in. Clearly you can tell she is not pleased to be at Worland High School and in room 303. Complete and total stranger to me. And she comes in, slams her books down on the desk, and the very first thing she shouts out, with a good number of students already in the room, is, "I hate this effing school." And the room gets, of course, quickly quiet, as everyone is watching to see how I will respond. It's a tough one. Why? Because in that moment, I recognize that I am being watched. Yes, I'm being watched. All my students, like, whoop, how's McGee going to respond to this one? I'm also aware that the student who just voiced this opinion of this place has maybe legitimate reasons to have this opinion of this place. And I have to honor at least the fact that she has a right to have an opinion about this place. Of course, the challenge for me is, do I have the energy to have some awareness of the dynamic that's happening in the room? Or, because this is the first day of school and I myself am just as tired as all these students because it's the first day of school, and I kind of lose my way really quickly. We're back to Dante lost in his wood of error, aren't we? And I say something or I respond in a certain way that will show all of my students very, very quickly in room 303, there really isn't the honesty that I am going to pretend that there might be. How to deal with something like this is immediately a challenge, which is why, again, we say there is no work harder than being a teacher. Man, oh man, is it tough work. I'm not saying that teachers can't make mistakes and therefore will lose their students. Obviously, we know that's true. However, I am saying that if I'm a teacher that's constantly trying to balance these four quadrants as it relates to myself, as it relates to my students, as it relates to others, I have a little better chance of being that 3 Ds. That is to say, in that moment with that young lady, I recognized that I had to be all 3 of those Ds simultaneously. I've got to be a distributor of knowledge, no question. Hey, welcome to room 303 and by extension to Worland High. But can I ask you a simple question? Do you think room 303 is the space of this room or the walls that hold it? Secondly, obviously I've got to be a developer of integrity, a developer of respect. We only have one rule in 303. It is that we respect first ourselves, then our colleagues, and then finally the school. What do you think you would feel like if I walked into your house today or into your room and I told you what I thought of your domicile? Would it affect you? Would it affect you negatively? Of course, my other students are listening, they're watching, they're hoping that I'm being reasonable, that I'm being honest with this student. And then finally, of course, we've got to be destroyers. We've got to be destroyers of pessimism is the way I like to think about it. Now, I don't believe in blind optimism. It is true that Whitman said, I see the sunny side of life. I like that idea. But it is an informed optimism in classrooms by teachers that are honest, that say, hey, can I challenge this opinion? Is there one thing today that maybe you could argue is something other than really, really cruddy? I'm really happy that you're here. And I've got a story I want to tell you. And you can tell me if the story makes any sense or not. So here's the question. Can I be honest about, back to our big 5, can I be honest about my epistemological position of fallibilism? That is to say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, and I'm willing to challenge myself to ask in the ways in which I have been wrong. And can I play that game with my students and those as well? Like this young lady, come to find out, because I did develop a relationship with her, she came from really, really rough stuff. And of course, any of us that have been in classrooms, we know this, don't we, right? The student who comes in, lays his head down, but then we find out that last night he was closing the small store that he works at 2 in the morning, and then he had to get up in the morning and come back to school. Can I challenge myself to be honest in terms of my ontological understanding? I am a body, no question. I'm also a mind, and I'm also a spirit, and I've got to balance those. And if I don't balance those, I'm not going to have the kind of energy that will allow me to address a challenge like the one we were outlining. Can I be honest about my views of psychology, and what are my chief fears and my motivations? We're going to be asking that question a lot in these talks. Sociologically, can I be honest, right? What is it that I'm a part of as a community. Like, I think about PLC. No question, we as teachers obviously enjoy this. And some of us are great advocates for it, and some of us are very great challengers of it. But can I live within communities? Can I be productive within those? Can I respect alternative points of view? It's an important question as it relates to students, as it relates to others. Finally, the question of theodicy. Can I be honest as it relates to asking? Can I learn to ask the right question? Why this happened for me in this moment, for example. Why this happened for me, not to me, as the student has challenged me right in front of all of the other students. Now, we got to be honest, and here's why. Because we know we're going to screw up. As teachers, we're going to be risk takers, and we know that we're going to screw up, and we're going to make mistakes. We are professional mistake makers, and that means we're going to have to practice forgiveness, which is where we're headed next in our next core concept. Now, I dare you, again, because dare to teach is our topic here, and we began with that word allons, let's go, from our Whitman reading of Song of the Open Road. I dare you to try to be a little bit more honest, a little bit more balanced in your thinking about the classroom. If, for example, you're working right now and you're thinking about planning for the next semester, challenge yourself. Can I be a little bit more honest with myself, with my students, with those outside my classroom? For example, watch this in your teachers' training journals. What was a time for in your life when you practiced honesty? And unfortunately, we always got to ask it, what was a time in your life when you didn't? Let's come back to talk about forgiveness next. Thank you.